Everyone, this is Elon. I'm here today with Chief Mark. We've been talking for a little while. He's got an incredible background. I'm really happy to have you on today, Mark. And I would love for you to give a little background about yourself for everyone.
Okay, well, I don't know about an incredible background. There are plenty of officers that have exceeded far what I've done in my mediocre career, but I've been an officer from various ranks for 32 years. Just celebrated my graduation from the academy yesterday, 32 years ago. It's a little bit whiter than it used to be. Um, I started off at a university, major university police department for 6 years. We had concurrent jurisdiction in Prince George's County. That was in University of Maryland. I came back to a Midwest department that got as big as 400 officers. I think right now there's somewhere around the 300 officer range with all some of the financial stuff the last few years. But I spent 20 years there, retired as a sergeant, and then I spent 20 years there, and then I started bouncing from different jobs. The wife was worried about my stability factor there for a while. I retired from that police department, took a director of public safety job for an airport, and ran a police and fire department for 3 years. Quite a bit different having civilians and oversight over the police and fire department. They do in regular government police departments, city managers, mayors, and that. But this is quite a bit more for when you talk about a little bit of a private police department, so to speak. Quite a bit different. Sort of like hospital policing, which I also had a few months in as a lieutenant. Very different when you see police and civilians. It would be no different than your average person with no military background running command of a military squad or platoon.
Yeah.
And it would be no different than me telling a doctor how to do a surgery. I mean, completely out of our league. And then I went, and because I had Washington, D.C. area at least for my state, a sizable metropolitan area, I needed some small police background, small town policing background in order to get the trust of people that I would subsequently interview with in order to say he's too big for us or whatever. I grew up in small towns all my life, but until you are small town policing, they just weren't believing that factor. So I'm a chief at a smaller police department now, great community, very supportive. Community policing is huge. We have our share of good cases that we get into, but I'm in a lot better spot than two of my sons who are at where I retired from. And it's a different story in that I'm going to say major city, where the respect isn't there. The riots happened. I had to experience them. The wife and I went through that one night. I'm looking at it a little bit different. It was kind of an adventure. I knew the kids would be safe. They've got great training. The wife was a mess, as you would imagine any mother would be watching. We were up till about 4 a.m. watching a live broadcast, and there was information coming out. One of the guys on the department or gals would text something out, and then the rest of the families would share what's going on. And some of the things that you would see it was not as was portrayed even weeks and months later by the press, saying I heard one network say it was a festival in the streets, and they were almost attacked because the rioter didn't want them to portray it like that. It was a very dangerous setting. And now you're seeing one side of the political spectrum actually admitting there was some violence, but still it's the other team's fault. But that's a little bit about my background.
Yep. Sounds pretty amazing to me. I wanted to touch on something. You said how you've noticed such a change between kind of community policing and big city policing. Do you mind expanding on that just a little bit? Your experiences versus what you feel like your kids' experiences are like nowadays?
Well, big cities can do some community policing just like anything else. And the definition of community policing is pretty much whatever you want it to be. I've had people say, well, we're not arresting people. We do community policing. We fix problems, hug people and everything like that. And then I've had chiefs that I've come up underneath where they said, no, community policing is we cite people, we arrest people, we address the problems that the citizens bring to us. And that's kind of more along the lines of how I believe it is. In reality, probably one of the biggest marketers of a department around. I mean, for a small department, we were on the news quite frequently for good things. We'll do a day where we stop people for minor traffic violations, and we give them frozen turkeys the whole Thanksgiving or turkey dinner. And it made the whole region news for our side of the state. And we do a lot of fun stuff like that with the kids at school, all the events. I mean, I'm not required to be, but I don't think there was a football game at home that I ever missed. And I also hit a girls basketball game and the girls softball game, because if I make one and I don't make the other, I'm kind of like an athletic director. I've got to be in a lot of places, and it's not an 8-hour a day job. Trust me, my wife says I'm down to about $3 an hour. That's maybe a little exaggeration, but I think it's how the community trusts you in this ongoing topic of police. They call it police violence. Is even people that traditionally supported the police are having doubts because the real data is not out there. So I started a presentation. Now, I wrote an article for the inaugural article for our State Police Chiefs Association at the request of the executive director. And it was written in 2015, and it applies more so today than ever. It was called Hanging On to Our Profession. And it's where civilians, politicians want to seize the reins because they can fix things and make it better. And it's like you hear somewhat on the social worker side, you know, there's a button you can push and you can de-escalate somebody. They'll put down a baseball bat or a knife or a gun, and all of a sudden there's this button that the cops have missed for the last 50 years. And everybody else can see that it's right there, but somehow the cops just aren't professional enough or smart enough to deal with that problem. And they've never been in that type of environment. So when I got my second police chief's job, I immediately began giving presentations to the citizens. I wanted to know that I had the support of that community before I really needed it. And one of the examples I gave to them in my interview was, you've got a person with a PIO background that knows how to handle the media, I mean, and work with them and be outspoken. The worst thing you can do is say nothing. I mean, the second best thing you do is say the wrong thing, and the best thing is to say the right thing. But if you just remain silent on this issue, it's going to take us over in this false, I'm going to call it a false narrative. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to people, because I know African American, Hispanic people feel, and there's genuine concern that, will that officer treat me the same as someone else? But I wrote that article with the idea that we are the experts in the field and have to have at least a seat at the table when it comes to these discussions. And I started watching more and more video where you'd have an NFL player, you'd have a sports announcer, and then maybe you'd have, you know, somebody else at the table, and they were talking about police community relations, but they didn't have one person at the seat. There was no cop there.
Yeah, you never see a police at.
Well, and some of it's our own fault. We're our own enemy, because police chiefs like me, not all of us are in my position, okay? Some of them have kids in college and they're paying bills and they need that paycheck just as bad as they did when they first started. And so you just go along to get along. And the problem is it gets taken over if you don't have, well, you've seen what a vocal minority can droop and how much attention they can gather. We need to do the same and say, wait a minute, it's not that extent that you're thinking. I mean, we're talking, you will interview some people and they'll say that police are probably killing 10 unarmed Black Americans a day. And the numbers are not
here.
Yeah, I mean, 3,650. And I mean, if you go by the CDC results from 2003 to 12, a 10-year period, it was 429. That's total. And it's a little bit different, but so far they all look consistent. This year's data is around like 228 Black males. And the year that I did it off the Johnson study, I think it was 248. So it's,
but that includes armed. That includes primarily armed people.
Oh, that's everything.
I know people. The number of unarmed people is significantly lower across any race.
That's another point on unarmed that I'd like to bring up. The media has us believing that unarmed means no threat.
I know.
Well, in the one data, there was over 3,100 murders that citizens do by hands, feet, strangulation, and forced drownings. 3,100 murders a year. So obviously people with their hands can do some damage. 3,121 murders, I think it was. And it depends on who the officer is, male, female, conditioning, and things like that. But a blow that can knock you out or daze you, there's now a gun on scene at least, and that's the officer's weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And my data might be a little bit dated in this regard, but at one time in my career, we said 25% of the officers killed were killed with their own weapon.
I wouldn't be
So,
surprised. Yeah.
and you saw the Atlanta situation where how easily he disarmed that taser from him. I mean, popping, it was out of the holster. Now, those probably don't have quite the retention that a pistol does, depending. But you saw how quickly that turned into now he has a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a demonstration, and I haven't practiced in probably 13 years, but I'm a black belt in Taekwondo, which means a first degree black belt means you just started to learn how to defend yourself. The guys that are second, third, and fourth degrees are some guys that are, I mean, I've been in the ring with some of them and I didn't know what I was doing there, right? But I can take 5 3/4 inch boards, 10 by 12 inch. So it's like two 2x4s and then a 3/4 inch piece of plywood on top and smash down on that and bust it. And if you do that to a human's rib cage, especially somebody of smaller stature, you've killed them just with your hands. And I'm 55 years old now. I don't have near the strength that I used to have, and I can still do that. And the first time I did it as a demonstration a few months ago, I said, I'm going to be forthright. I'm a little bit nervous right now because I haven't done this in 13 years. I know how to not blow out my shoulder, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I did 4 boards because I was scared. And after I did it, I said, no, I could do 5. But you put 5 3/4 inch boards on top. That is like a block of wood, but you can create enough forward fluid shock wave to just splinter that. And if that's your sternum on somebody, you've messed their internal organs up. And the next thing along with that is, when do police officers, it only counts if they die. Nobody thinks to the point where a serious or a life debilitating injury is it just has the officers, if the officer would have died, then it's okay. But if he blows 3 herniated discs on his back and can't pick up his or her grandkids the rest of his life, we're supposed to put up with that.
Yeah.
I mean, the policies say serious injury, not that, it's going to be some minor or somebody spits at you or something that we've all had happen. But that if somebody comes at you with a ball bat and connects to your noggin, you're going to have a brain injury that you didn't have before.
Yeah, most likely, or dead. Yeah, one or the other.
And
Can't anticipate that.
Exactly. And the press is like, well, it wasn't a deadly threat. In other words, it may not have killed the officer. So we retired him, we pay for his retirement, and we completely overlook the fact that the person that brings that attack on or doesn't submit has no accountability for it.
Yeah, anyone who says that hasn't been in a real confrontation. If someone's swinging a bat at your head, that's a deadly situation. If someone's hitting you with a skateboard, that's a deadly situation. Someone has a beer bottle and they're attacking you, that's a deadly situation.
Right.
Like you said, your hands can be a deadly situation when there's a gun on the scene, which there always is with a police officer.
Exactly.
And without. I mean, I've seen people get hit in the head, they fall, they hit the back of their head on the concrete, and they're dead. It happens all the time.
I handled a homicide just like that. 2 guys in a fight, and it was February. The ice was slippery. His feet went out, hit the curb, dead. It was a murder charge. And it was just it was what you called the proper way to settle a dispute. We didn't shoot. We didn't use a knife. We're going to go out and settle this like men. And now you have a murder charge.
Mm-hmm.
So people who look at these scenarios don't realize how fragile life is and the inhumanity that cops see. Heroin addicts that fall asleep on their infants and kill them because they've smothered. I mean, the things that your average officer from departments all over this country see that you should never have to see. You know how fragile that life is. In one punch, just to the right spot, and now you don't have the same memory you used to have.
Mm-hmm.
Just because a person didn't want to go to jail because they had a child support warrant or something simple like just suspended license. At some point, the person who's causing this has to be brought into it. Does that mean the officer should maybe overreact or not use a correct force decision or what have you? No, I'm not excusing that. But all of these things go back to, what was the core conflict? Was it somebody refusing to turn around and be handcuffed? Somebody refusing to put down a knife, a gun, submit to arrest, whatever. And we've lost that part of the equation where we're not holding people accountable equally on both sides for their decisions.
Well, I think you touched on an important thing again there. We're conflating every case as the same thing. In other words, the case of George Floyd is the same as Jacob Blake, is the same as whatever future case comes out. There's no awareness of subtlety. There's no awareness of circumstance or context. So if one person was killed in a way that people agree was not appropriate or there was excessive use of force, it means that we have to agree on all future cases.
Mm-hmm.
So the case where someone was down on the ground for 9 minutes with a knee on his neck, whether he OD'd on fentanyl, I personally, the George Floyd one, I've been very critical of the police officer in that situation,
Mm-hmm.
even with the additional information come out. But I see the Jacob Blake case as entirely different, the recent one that just happened. I don't see how you can conflate the two. The circumstances are different. The context is different. The guy was literally back at a woman's house to rape her again, or potentially rape her. I don't know exactly what was happening there. So there's a whole different context to how the events led up. Society, civilians in general, have lost their ability to analyze a situation and not have immediate judgment based on a 3-second video clip. We're obsessed with just watching a clip. And so,
I mean, would you want your work performance as an employee based on how your employee in the other cubicle did, or the cubicle in another state? I mean, none of that has to do. I want to be judged on the actions that I did because I trust my training. I trust what I did. We're talking about not stereotyping people, but that's exactly what's happening to cops. Yes. It's like this happened in Georgia, that happened in Minneapolis, so you're just as bad as that guy. And it's like, that goes against everything that you fought for to not be stereotyped. And now you're doing the same exact thing, and you're doing it from a profession point of view. It's amazed. I gave that presentation, and people, I had a guy from Detroit, black male in my community. I invited him to the meeting. I had to go find him because our community is not very diverse. And I saw him putting wood in the back of a truck. It's 95-degree day. And I went, wow, that guy is working. I could hardly stand standing outside. We're not used to that in our state, 95 degrees and humid. And so I pulled up next to him with a car, and he kind of gave me a look, and I said, man, you're working too hard to be out here in this heat. He just smiled, and he came over, and I did a lot of things. One is I wanted to see if he was sweating to make sure he wasn't having heat stroke or heat exhaustion and that. And we got talking. I said, hey, I give this presentation I'd like you to come to. Well, he came to the presentation, and about 2 weeks later, my wife was at the presentation too, and she goes, I want you to contact him again because you said a couple of things where you get close to the line. I don't want that young man. He brought his son, 14-year-old son, which I initially wasn't thrilled about because I show some videos. They're not really bad, but 14 is age appropriate, you know. And he said, no, I want my son there because my son flipped off one of your officers and he is going to come to this presentation. So we have a dad who is being a parent. And I said, okay, I know he's in the front row. I will be cognizant of language on the screen and all that, some of the demonstrations of commands that we give in doing the demonstration. But I called him a couple weeks later and said, hey, how did I do? Was anything offensive or whatever? And he said, Mark, I called all my family in Detroit. I have never heard that before. He goes, it takes a lot to offend me. But he goes, I told them there's another perspective out here. And you've got to come here and hear this sometime. And I was just kind of touched me that that he thought that. I mean, they hear things like, and what I said was statistics are everything and you can make them what you want. So people look at cops and they say, well, first of all, we don't use force proportionally. Use force on the threat that is presented to you. It doesn't matter if it's white, black, red, green person, you use what you're given. And so you can't control that if you're doing your job properly. So when I tell him, here's the stats that you hear in the news, that 25%, actually 6.6% of the population are black males, yet they are killed at like 25% of the time by police officers. The average person says, well, you kill them at 4 times their population. Again, we don't do it by background. And I said, well, turn that around. 33% of the police officers killed are killed by black males. So if there's homicides on black males at 25%, but there's homicides on cops by that group at 33%, the officers aren't racially disparaging killing black males. They're killing them at less than what they themselves are being killed at, if you look at that statistic. And that's because the urban environment, there's more violence and more crime there. We didn't used to be able to say that. Now I think people actually say, here's the geo stuff.
I've lived in rough neighborhoods. There's more crime in certain neighborhoods. It is.
You could take my city, about 40 of them and put a couple 100,000 people together, or you could take the one city that my kids work at where I retired from at 200,000, and I can bet and tell you where the next shooting or next homicide is going to be. It's going to be in that large city. It's not going to be in the 40 or 50 towns my size that I work at now. We go to shootings now, my kids do, where there's 40, 50, 60 shell casings. When I worked there, you find 3 or 4 shell casings, a drug deal went bad. Now you're finding magazine loads daily, 2 or 3 shootings a night. It's just the violence is out of control.
Violence is big time out of control, which is sad because it's a result of the exact rhetoric that we hear. And again, it's very hard to tell someone who feels like they're targeted, who feels like they're a victim of something, that you may not be the problem. I think the bigger issue is that it is a distraction from the very thing you mentioned, which is that there's neighborhoods that have high poverty, they have high single parent households, they have high drug use. And if you grow up in that neighborhood, and sometimes the elements in that neighborhood, I've lived in them, you define your masculinity by doing these things, by being in a gang, by being, tough, or by whatever that thing is. That's what defines your masculinity, because there's not that many positive male role models around. Exactly. And so if your father's not at home, you're out walking on the street, there's guys dealing drugs, they're getting respect, you want to be a man, you want to get respect, you see that as your idol, you become part of it. It's very easy. It's a system that recycles itself. I think that a lot of the focus on police is a distraction from why those systems exist and where they came from. Because I really do believe that it is a history of racism. It really is a history of, you had Jim Crow, you had segregation, you had redlining, you had all these issues with the school system and education. The breakdown of the 2-parent household was intentional. We can't talk about any of that stuff that is stemmed in true racism, because the conversation is always like, look at this cop who shot somebody in this 3-second video with no context, and it represents all police, and police are your enemy. We can't talk about racism. We can't talk about crime. We can't talk about black on black violence. So I have a huge kind of visceral response to that, because it is allowing a certain system, which is truly rooted in racism, to continue. And people believe that they're fighting racism by allowing it to continue. It's the exact contradiction of what the actual solution is.
Right.
Like you said, community policing solves a lot of these issues. Helping education would solve a lot of these issues.
Right.
School choice, something that for some reason, and not to become political, but something that Democrats are consistently against, would solve a lot of these issues. And so, and help battle redlining. So for me, it's very fascinating, the obsession that society now has over police and vilifying them. I think it's rooted in something much more insidious, personally. That's not to say all cops are great, and that's not to say that police can't do something bad, but we don't hold that standard to doctors who go have malpractices at a significantly higher rate.
Well, 251,000 a year. And I bring that up in the presentation, and I say, I don't mind the medical profession. My wife's a nurse. I have 2 daughters-in-law that are nurses. Another daughter-in-law is a physician assistant. I mean, I have a sister-in-law that's a doctor, but medical malpractice, where none of those are justified. Johns Hopkins reports about 251,000 medical errors, malpractice deaths per year in the police cause. If you believe the Washington Post data, about 990, about 1,000 a year. CDC for a 12-year average says about 429. So when I do a demonstration, I put 100 cards with their backs on a table. It takes about a 6-foot long table, about 3 feet, and you have 100 cards there. And I said, each one of these cards represents over 2,500 deaths. And then I take a little small strip about less than an inch wide on a sticker on one of the cards, and I replace it. And I say, if you believe the Washington Post at 1,000 deaths a year, that little 1-inch strip on this whole table full of cards is the number of deaths police officers cause, and this whole table is what medical malpractice is. And there's not a ton of more doctors than there are cops. About 700, 800,000 cops to about 1 million, 1,000,001 doctors. And then I take the CDC, and it's now a real little thin strip of orange. I mean, like maybe 1/4 of an inch, and I put that down. And I said, not to say that we can't do better, and we always are striving to get better, but let's put this in perspective. Is anybody doing statistics on how many malpractice deaths were African American or Hispanic? Is there any trends there? No, it's just not personal. It's not sensational enough. And the media doesn't buy into it. I will sit down with the audience and say, does anybody know about your state's chief medical officer in this state? Did anybody hear any news story? And of course, I get nothing. Less than a year ago, he was charged with overprescribing opioids when he was on a committee for not for watching the prescription of opioid drugs. I said, here's an Ohio doctor that was charged with 25 counts of murder, because he was given doses that the medical profession said there was no legitimate reason for it. They don't charge doctors with that kind of a backing of the medical associations behind them unless they got a drop dead case. 25, and people say, I didn't hear that. But if some cop in Alabama or Nebraska has a traffic stop tonight and a warrant, and a guy gets out and throws punches and somebody ends up getting shot, that'll be on news worldwide. The United States has had another white officer shoot a minority person.
I had a friend who died from opioid overdose from prescription medication, and I had a knee surgery, and I was given 30 Oxycontins a day, and I got addicted to them, and they ended up trying to tell me, oh, well, we'll give you another painkiller to get off of this painkiller. And my dad was like, he locked me in a room and he was like, no, you just deal with it. You'll get through it in a month. And I did, but I mean, I had a bad surgery on my whole leg. And it's crazy the way I used to hear these athletes getting addicted to pain meds.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, oh, it doesn't make sense. They're just weak. And then it happened to me. I was like, no, the pharmaceutical industry can really put you on. But you don't hear anyone saying burn down all doctors and shooting doctors in the face and saying that doctors are evil. We need to create our own community doctors. Like, you just don't hear that. And it's happening we're talking about, like you said, 10 unarmed Black people a year is cause for this kind of response. But hundreds of thousands a year are not cause. And you're right, it is disparate. There are studies on the medical community and bias within the medical community about treatment toward minorities. No one wants to talk about that. No one wants to acknowledge that. No burn down the medical industry. No shoot doctors on the street.
No.
Doctors are pigs. You don't hear any of that stuff. And people don't realize this rhetoric that we're having today, I truly believe, just increases the chance of a negative encounter with a police officer. If you're raised to be scared of police officers, if you're told they're going to kill you, if you're told to tell them to F off and to be rude, and that rioting and violence is okay, and that all cops are bad and they're racist, and then you have an encounter with a police officer, number one, if he's been hearing that rhetoric too about himself, he's going to be more defensive and be more likely to worry about his own safety. And you're also going to be more defensive. The end result is statistically more problems between police and communities. We need to be bringing people together, exactly like you said, like having conversations, allowing trust to be rebuilt, allowing people to understand this is not happening at the rate that people like to perpetuate it as. And I've even told people, I'm like, how do you feel about these statistics? These statistics, do you believe them? Do you claim it's a conspiracy? If they don't claim it's a conspiracy, they say even one person a year dying is too much. I don't care. It's disgusting that you're even bringing up the numbers. I'm like, it's not disgusting because it paints a picture of what we should be focusing on and what we shouldn't be focusing on. My dad always...
Any job that they would have, do we sell enough product to keep you employed? That person would say that data is important.
Yes.
Or your performance review, you had this many complaints and this many attaboys. We keep track of these numbers. So you keep track of the numbers that benefit them, but the numbers that don't fit an agenda sometimes are forgotten about.
Well, you're just accused of being racist for bringing it up, for saying this is the amount of people who died. You're racist. I'm not racist. I'm telling you the amount of people who died. That's the information. You do with it as you please. If you want to say that you're all going to die because 10 people died a year for unarmed, in situations where 6 that year were proven and to have been very violent and aggressive. So 4 people that are questionable a year, if that's your basis, that we live in a systemically racist society, then go ahead and believe that, but that's not going to solve anything.
No, and one thing when I show the videos, and my videos are, in police work, I'd call them a 3 or 4 out of a 10. There's nothing where it shows a police officer getting murdered and it's just horrendous. I take the ones that are the least sensational that serves the point, but I had a couple with a social worker background in there and they just didn't want to see it. They said, don't show this again, don't do this. But then and I took it in as input because I realized, okay, this first you have to identify the problem, and if you have an audience that doesn't want to even see the problem, or understand or go in that person's boots. What kind of consultant could you be if you hired a consultant that said, I just want your money, I really don't want to know what your true problem is, I don't want to dissect it and figure out what's this force thing all about, is this an overreaction, is this a good policy, is this a proper use of force? Then how are you sitting there saying, well, I don't think this is the right time for that message? And I thought to myself, and didn't say it, I thought, when is it the right time to tell the truth? Is there a wrong time? And I've got a couple of notes here. I just wanted to hit some of the stats. But I had, as a PIO, I had an instructor come in. So he changed sides. He went from the journalist and all that to say, here's how you got to deal with people in our group. And shut that off. And he said, there's three things that the press feeds on, and that's drama, conflict, and fear. Those move people to action, and it's all about ratings. And the guy was very forthright. And so I try to find examples where other people say it so that it doesn't look like here's the white cop trying to put a spin on it. So I had a CNN anchor that I found he did a clip on. I thought it was very well done. He said, is our perception based on data and the real story, or is it all based on a story as opposed to what the data says? And he went on and he goes, this violence of 2020 reminds me of the summer of 2001, the year of the shark. And he went on to say that an 8-year-old boy had his arm ripped off by a shark, and they had 300 times more media inquiries. Hey, can we take a quick break? Somebody's from dispatch trying to call me.
Sure, absolutely.
If you want to freeze it up, I'll see what I can.
I'll leave it running and I'll cut this whole part out, just because if I stop it, it'll start to.
All right.
Private, we can turn it off and.
No, I'll see what's going on. We had a couple. Oh, it was a county number. If they need me, they'll get back. Okay. All right, where was I? Oh, so the year of the shark. So they had 300, and I can't forget the name of the organization. It was the Shark Attack File. They maintain the file of how many shark attacks and where they occur at. They had received 300 times more press inquiries. Every time there was a close call or any type of a scratch or anything, the media was on it. And people didn't go to beaches. They didn't go to the East Coast. Communities suffered. And they found in reality, there was, I believe, 9 fewer shark attacks that year, the year of the shark, than there was the previous year. In the previous year, there were 12 fatal shark attacks. The year of the shark, there were 5, less than half. So he said, by actually covering the story, you exacerbate how bad it is. And I said, here's the example. He went into, you remember the Dominican Republic a couple of years ago. If you go to the Dominican Republic, you're going to be kidnapped and killed. You just won't show up. And he put on there the statement from the State Department that said, okay, there's all this stuff going on. 2.7 million people visit the Dominican Republic each year. We don't keep stats on this, but we have not noticed any uptick in deaths in the Dominican Republic. But you had people changing their vacation plans and saying, I'm not going there. It's not safe, just because the media covered it. Mm-hmm. And then it's a little bit of the slant, well, another unarmed person, or, and there's no justification that we've seen so far. They get it into people's minds that this was bad before the facts come out. Like you said, before taking the situation, each of their own accord. I want my file to recommend or to reflect what I did, not what somebody did in another state. And let's see. We had, if you put it in perspective, there was 41,149 deaths from suicide. So that's 41.6 times of what the police homicide rate is. And people don't understand numbers like that. When you start talking millions and billions and trillions, our mind doesn't have the capacity to be able to think that way. But if you put a factor of 41, that's like your car getting 20,000 miles per tank. If you were to do a 20 mile per gallon car with 41 times the mileage, it's unbelievable. And so when we had those 60 doctors that you didn't hear much about that were indicted in the Appalachian states for putting 32 million pills into this 5-state area, I tell people that a narco pill is about 14 millimeters long. And I said, if we were to put them end to end, you know how far we would go? Of course, people go, I've got no idea. 278 miles of pills that got pumped into those states. Every man, woman, and child could have a dose of opioids, and it's like Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, West Virginia. I mean, it was like it was like 5 different states, and the amount of damage that was done there. But people didn't know what story I was even talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the press, just by covering it, oh, this must be happening all the time. And it creates, whether they mean to or not, some of them, yep, ratings and sensationalism sells. But just the fact that you're even covering that story, it must be a common occurrence.
Well, it's like you said, that, sorry, the mind cannot address statistics. It can only address what it sees. So if you hear there's 60 million police interactions a year, there's 900,000 police officers, and there's 10 people killed, unarmed, who are African-American, that doesn't really mean anything to people. What they see is one video, and that's what forms their opinion.
Right.
I see a plane accident. For years, I was scared of being on planes because I saw a couple high-profile plane accidents, and the media sensationalized it. I started having this insane panic until I realized the statistics are very unlikely for me to die on a plane, and I got over it.
Right.
But it's hard to rationalize that when you become scared of something.
Right. And I'm just looking at this as far as, okay, in 2017, the FBI said that there were 48,300 assaults on police officers. People get to thinking that there's 100, 150 officers killed a year. That's not that much. Ironically, 8 or 9 unarmed deaths but 150 or 200 officers is not that big a number. But nearly 50,000, and that's only with 2/3 of the police departments reporting 50,000 assaults. If you extrapolate that number out, it's like 60-some thousand assaults. And there ends up being about 13 or 14,000 deadly assaults with weapons. So if you do the math and you say, okay, if there's 1,000 police-caused homicides and there's 13 to 14,000 deadly assaults, that means about 1 out of 13 or 14 deadly assaults does a police officer end up taking a life. Now, if you believe the CDC number of 429, 29 out of 30 deadly assaults against a cop does not result in the suspect or perpetrator dying. 29 out of 30. But if somebody were to come in your room and you and I were seated in the same room and they said, Elon, you did something to me or whatever, and he started to pull a gun, all the people I do this little skit with would say, yeah, I'd want you to pull your gun and stop him if he had a gun and was going to shoot me. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, let's say you ticked off a second person and he came around the room. You had a bad week. Would you want me to do that? Well, yeah, I'd want you to do it. Let's cut to the chase. If 10 people come around the room, do you want me to do it 10? Yeah. Well, a cop does it once out of 30 times, and he's a bad guy or bad girl for doing that.
In a situation of deadly, of the person posing a deadly threat as well.
And I would say that the officer is taking his risk because the attack is on him, a lot more risk. I mean, the situation in Kenosha, they shouldn't be within 30 feet of that person with a knife. In the old days, we called it a 21-foot rule.
Yeah, I know, because you can't
I would take 7. Yeah, now it's expanded to 30 feet. Mm-hmm. So I would take a group of Citizen Police Academy people, and I would take 7 steps away. And as soon as I hit 7, I'd turn around and run at them. And they're like, I mean, you got here in no time at all. And I said, yeah, and I'm an old man. Mm-hmm. And I said, imagine if you were hopped up on a little drugs, or you're a 24-year-old fast. I mean, you don't have time to even think what's going on, and they're on top of you. He's got him by the shirt, trying to stop him in every way until he makes a decision, right or wrong. It's up for the facts to see where they lay.
I agree.
To take that deadly shot. But the fact that he's grabbing onto this guy with this knife when it's simple turnaround and a stab in the wrong area, and he's a dead person.
I was surprised he got that close to begin with. I mean,
you saw the backup officer kind of following, not because they're not trained. We're not trained to tackle people armed with knives.
It's stupid to get close to someone armed with a knife in any case.
Stay back there. We got you at gunpoint. Don't move. Drop the knife. Drop the knife. Don't come at us or whatever. Instead, they're trying to do everything to they're breaking every rule. Mm-hmm. Officers, and they're not because they're bad guys or bad, not wanting to follow policy. They really wanted this guy to all of a sudden just go to the ground and give up. I mean, and they put serious risk, especially the guy now has one working hand because he's got his firearm in the other.
Yes, he was putting himself in very serious risk. And again, kind of just to touch on that, it's interesting how no matter what the shooting is, I did a video on this in the past, how the media really is distorting things. If you just type in white man on Google, We'll say white man kills black man, or white cop kills black innocent unarmed black man. That's the only search results that come up. Doesn't matter where you type in, just white man. If you type in black man, the same thing. If you just type in white, it comes up white privilege, white this, white that. The media is very much driving racial division, even in cases where it doesn't apply, just by search algorithms, just by what they put out there. I hope everyone tests it. Just type white man, white cop, black man, black officer. Just type little things into your Google and see the results that come up.
Right.
See if we're being programmed to hate each other based on the color of our skin, and that it's time for us to start actually doing the opposite and saying, I'm going to start separating myself a little bit from what I'm reading and start looking at the reality of it. I'm going to start looking at my neighbor as my neighbor again. I'm not going to, hyper focus on race and identity politics. I really hope that we can get back there as a country, because we've never, in my lifetime, there's never been this kind of obsession with race and identity and putting people in hierarchies. And it's just so dangerous. I don't think people realize how dangerous it is.
Right. Another thing that I do is, if we're going back on stats, is I would tell them in 1971, there were 1,562 shootings, police-involved shootings in New York City. So we'll put a bar graph up there, and I'll put a 15.6-inch line. Every line is 100 shootings. So you got bigger than a piece of notebook paper, that tall. Several inches taller than that. And then I say, what do you think there were? How many people do you think were shot? Now, I don't know if the stats are apples to apples, because one is officer-involved shootings. So the officer could have missed and nobody was hit. The 2017 stat is how many people were shot and hit. But I said, you got to allow some of that, but there's 1,562 in New York City. How many do you think there were in 2017? And then I say, well, wait a minute. I'm a cop and I'm trying to trick you, right? But you got to give me this. There's 750,000 more people in New York City now than there were in 1971. And there's 35,000 cops. I don't know what the sworn strength of NYPD was in 1971, but it wasn't 35,000.
No.
And I say, and I pull out buffet tickets to the local casino and say the closest one is and so now I got people scrambling down numbers, and I'll get numbers from several thousand to some saying, well, I think I'm going to lowball it and make it 1,000. And the number is 23. And when I say that, they say 2,300. And I say, no, 1,562 in 1971. In 2017, there was 23 people shot by cops. And all of a sudden you just see this reality. They're like, no. And I say, yes, 23. So then we put on our graph, which is like actually down here, a 1/4 inch line. And I say to the people across the room, you all can see the 15.6-inch line. Is anybody having trouble seeing the 1/4 inch line? And that's where we've come in policing, because the Supreme Court gave us a new set of rules and we kept following them. And that's why it's reduced that much. We used to shoot felons in the back. If you broke into a house and you ran, our job was sworn to stop him. When I was a kid, they said, can you use deadly force on someone who is trying to take your life, life of another, or a fleeing violent felon? And if you said no, you weren't hired, because you had to have the ability to do that because you're sworn to protect life. And that's how we did it. Now they say, well, Tennessee versus Garner was a 15-year-old black kid that broke into a house, jumped over a fence to get away. The officer shot. He fell, died on the other side. Supreme Court took the case and said, we don't know if we like that anymore.
Yeah.
So the police said, okay, well, these are the new rules. We don't shoot fleeing felons unless they're a serious threat to continue that violence. They pick up a weapon and keep running, or they run to go pick up a weapon, or they've been back to this house several times. They've tried to burn it down, and or we had a case where the guy drove around, he killed 7 members of a family and continued looking for them. We fired at him 10 different times to stop this guy. He's already killed 7 members of his family. And
that's a whole different thing. Yeah.
That's a thing where you're stopping an individual. Well, one judge dissented, at least one, Sandra Day O'Connor, and President Obama years later gave her Presidential Medal of Freedom. But her thought was, you don't have the right to escape due process just because you're worried more about your life. We have to stop you if you're of danger to society. Now, she was overruled in that, and the cops, that's why you see a 1/4 inch line there, along with Graham versus Connor. It has to be reasonable what you did. Years and years ago, before I got on the police department, they gave us an example in training where the two cops would work as a team. The driver would make the stop, go up and get the driver's license, registration, insurance, and the passenger officer, he's filling out the citation, got his head down, filling in the location, the violation, the plate numbers, and all that stuff. And this is back, must have been in the 60s or 70s. And all of a sudden, the passenger officer hears this boom, and his partner falls away from the car. He thinks his partner's just been shot. So he pulls a shotgun, shoots the driver. But the bad thing is it was a car backfiring. It wasn't a shot at all. It was justified homicide back then. Today, the cop would be in jail. He'd be civilly sued. The DOJ would come after him. Yeah. And that's the thing. There is no double jeopardy with cops. It's like quadruple jeopardy. And they want to get rid of qualified immunity now. Now, you get charged by your state or county prosecutor, and then your attorney general for the state can come after you. Even if you're convicted by your county prosecutor or the state attorney general, the feds can then come after you for civil rights violation. There's no double jeopardy attaching. You can be charged with a civil rights violation as a cop because you're a public official. Then the civil courts, of course, and then termination and discipline through the department. So you get quadruple whammy at all directions, and not many people sign up for that. The qualified immunity says if I don't violate a known constitutional right, I'm kind of protected. Otherwise, you'd never have a police officer put a set of handcuffs on somebody because they say, "Oh, you hurt my wrist. I need $5,000." And if you had that, it wouldn't pay to do the job.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's pretty crazy how far things are going. I'm not gonna lie. I don't like the idea of people just running away who haven't done something very violent, being shot in the back either. Yeah, so no, I'm not against that change you mentioned.
No, we none of us. In today's, and even when I started, you would have officers that will talk in groups in choir practice to talk about the time I almost shot so-and-so, or I almost shot a guy. And it's invariably, I'm still here, so thank God I didn't. I came very close when I was at the University of Maryland. They had a really bad fight. We called them the residents. They were the townies, and then the university kids would get in these brawls. And this kid was just putting the boots to another kid. We ended up taking his shoes as evidence because of blood all over him. But he ran, and I was in a foot chase with him, and he runs in, and with the three dorms form he can't get out, and then there's big electrical units in the back, and he reaches in his waistband and he turns around. This is dark out, and I hit him with my flashlight. He had a bottle of Lowenbrau beer. I don't know if you remember it, but the aluminum foil would go like 2/3 the way down the bottle, and it was all crinkly. So from no matter what angle you hit it, you get a silver flash, and you think that's a gun. You could even think in a heightened moment that he was firing at you. And I just about squeezed the trigger on that kid. And I think, thank God I didn't. And the judge, when we went into court, I gave a statement of facts, and the judge even said, "Mr. So-and-so, you are lucky to be alive here today." And I think, man, my life would be drastically different if I would have pulled the trigger. Because here's another stat. 4 out of 5 cops that take the life justifiably, they're cleared, they're put back on the job. 4 out of 5 quit within 5 years. Mm-hmm. They've done their time. They said, I did what I had to do. You had a speaker on I watched, and he became emotional when he talked about a kid that put him, he called his hand, he couldn't wait any longer. The risk was too great. And he knows he made the right call, but you could see in his face, he didn't, if he could do it all over and make that day never happen, he would. Yeah. And we tell those kids in the academy, I call them kids, sorry, we tell them, if you shoot somebody, it's got to be the right decision, because you'll have trouble living with it if it's not. If you shoot quick, or it's not the right force, or you panic, or you do whatever, because you just now went to college for a couple of years, maybe 4 years, and you want to jump in, and nobody says after that class, "Hey, I just want to go out and shoot somebody," because there's the pretty much 80% chance your career's over, or you're going to have to go do something different, even if you're correct.
Yeah. Even just the emotional impact it has on you is
well, our soldiers, I've been told by Colonel Grossman that does a lot that it's not the medical or the mental anguish and the PTSD is not to the level that the press is telling us. There's some good functioning vets out there, but there's a reason. And some of these guys have killed some pretty bad guys that are setting bombs for our people and blowing their partners' limbs off and everything. And you still have to go through that. My dad was a butcher, And he says, after you kill so many cows, it's just like, yeah, if I never do that again. I mean, it's a job. You have to do it. You have to eat. We all go to the grocery store, most of us anyway, and purchase hamburger or steaks. And that's still something to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow the people are getting the message that the cops just can't wait to go out there and just start emptying their magazines. And while I can't say it's zero, I can tell you I've never seen it in 32 years. And the department I went and spent 20 years with has fatally taken, I believe it's 4 lives in 25 years, and each one of those 4 fired at the cops first. And now that town is being burnt down to the tune of millions of dollars of damage. And nothing happened at the time of George Floyd in this state to draw that type of scrutiny. But there's your generalization again.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, Mark. I mean, I think it was some great information here, and I think it's going to help people understand more of what's going on.
Yeah. I'm just flipping through while you're talking. Go ahead. This is such a diverse, you could spend 40 hours talking. I mean, we cover unarmed people, we cover fleeing people, we cover, race, the fact that the percentage you're reacting to the percentage of people that are violent towards you. And it's where the most crime occurs is what's happening. I was surprised to learn how California, are you in California?
Right now I am, yeah. Temporarily.
The crime rate, when I started doing this, it just blew. I thought Sunshine State. Yeah, they're a little bit different on that coast. I couldn't believe some of the crime and saw that in Kern County, like the murder rate.
I lived in an area called Carson right near Compton, and there was a lot of gang activity there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I looked at Stockton, Long Beach.
Yeah. Long Beach is much better. But yeah, Long Beach was rough. Carson was still rough up until recently. Compton now is starting to clean up. But yeah, there's rough areas in California. People don't realize how bad it
gets. And when you send an officer in to handle calls into an area where the national average is murders, it's like 4.6 per 100,000 to where it's 14 or 15 per 100,000. Mm-hmm. That's a violent, that he's not going to get that person to probably want to get handcuffed as quickly as somebody in the general area that it's not the case.
No, and interestingly enough, those neighborhoods like that I lived in, the community wanted more police there because they knew that gang activity or criminal activity was real and that you had less of it when police are around. When police patrolled,
right,
you had less homicide, you had less shootings, you had less cars being broken into, you had less homes being broken into. So of course if you're an innocent person, regardless of race, regardless of anything, and there's a lot of crime in your area, the number one solution to it is police. That's just the solution. I've seen it work time and time again where I've lived.
Well, that's the crime rate, the misconception of crime rate. If you have a city council or whatever that has to lay a couple of police officers off, they're going to see a decrease in the crime rate. And then when the money comes back and the chief wants more money and they say, well, chief, why should we hire the cops back? The crime rate went down. And if he stammers at all, he shouldn't have been the chief of police. Because I can tell you, when those cops leave, they're not making those arrests. If he's on vacation or laid off and he didn't see a car go blowing through a stop sign and stop it and find the driver had a suspended license, got arrested, and then they find drugs and a stolen gun in the car, none of that ever happened if that officer's not there to see that stop sign violation. Mm-hmm. And so what's really scary now is the violence and the crime rates you're seeing in the big cities. The cops have withdrawn.
Yeah,
they can say whatever they want. And so the crime rate should be going down because they're doing crossword puzzles, anything to keep from going into that community because they're being charged with murder. The people they're causing damage. So when you see the cops withdraw and the crime rate still goes through the roof, that means it's astronomical and exponential what's actually going on. Because if you pull half the cops out, they're not going to make those arrests from a proactive point of view. And they just become report cards that come around and take it. And then when you bring cops in, consequently, the council will bring you in and say, why is our crime rate going up? Well, because you wanted me to hire a couple new cops, which is great. The idea is we get a handle on it and we control it, and then it goes back down after a few years. People no longer drive drunk in our town, for example. All kinds of studies showing if you arrest a certain portion of the drunk driving population, you'll have a dramatic effect on it. But if you just let it go and people say, I can go to the bar and drive home drunk 20, 30, 40 times a year, it happens, it happens. But as soon as you take an aggressive stance towards it as law enforcement, you will change that behavior where people will say, need a designated driver, we're getting a cab, Uber, you name it. You have an effect on it. But they have to deal with the initial crime rate going up when you bring cops in, because they're acting on it. They're told, go out and enforce the law. And it doesn't matter what color it is. If that car is doing something, you stop it. And if it's at 2 a.m, you really don't know who you're stopping at the time. And that's another whole set of stories of, well, the only reason you stopped me is because of this. I didn't know, for example, if a dog's driving the car when I got up there, but you know,
No,
but hey, I would just want to give you a thanks for having this kind of a forum, allowing people to have a voice. Hopefully it's not just cops watching this. Hopefully it's,
I'm sure.
hopefully it's people that are willing to look at a different point of view and keep an open mind and say there is a second thing out there. What the media is feeding me is probably got a slant to it. And yeah, while I might see it in this state one day and that state the next week and maybe next month in that state, statistically speaking, there's more chance, I've heard, that you'd be struck by lightning than an African-American male being killed by a cop.